Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our coffee morning, a coffee or tea and a slice of life. And many years ago, I read this particular book and was quite challenged by it and thought it was actually quite a good topic to use for this morning. So I've given it this cryptic title of A River, a Bridge and Some Prisoners. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with, that's the title picture from a film that was made from it in the late 1950s. Anyone got a clue? Anyone recognise it? Correct, The Bridge Over the River Kwai. That's it. Or The Bridge on the River Kwai. Now, this film itself was actually made in 1957. It was based on a book by Pierre Boulez, and it tells the story of Allied prisoners, the Allied prisoners of war who were held by the Japanese, and they were forced, in contravention to all the conventions of how you deal with military prisoners, forced to work on building the Burma Railway. Now, Burma Railway was some 254 miles long. It was cut through very dense jungle, which the prisoners had to cut and clear first. And it wasn't just prisoners, by the way. Tens of thousands of natives were dragged into this. And the idea was to complete a railway link between Bangkok, Thailand and Rangoon. And the whole purpose was it would allow the Japanese Empire a gateway to bring supplies and attack India. And that was the heart of the British Empire in those days. Over 90,000 civilians and 12,000 prisoners of war died during the construction of this railway. And this film sort of focused in on just this one bridge over the River Kwai. Everyone was suffering from the strains of doing the heavy construction work with poor nutrition, malnutrition, disease, brutal attitudes from the Japanese guards, and just sheer overworking them. It was a tough place to be. As I said, the book and the film focus on building this one bridge, and this really, it all takes place between 1942 and 1943, and the Allied troops have been ordered to surrender. They were treated badly, they were badly fed, their spirits were all but broken. And then this British colonel in charge of the prisoners decides to get morale up. But we're going to build the best bridge the British Empire can do, despite having rotten materials and so forth. And he encourages his men to work as hard as they can on this bridge, bearing in mind they've got the worst materials you can work with. And when our Allied command sent a saboteur, an American commando, goes to blow the bridge up, this colonel spots the wire and tries to stop him, because he was completely obsessed with building the perfect bridge. That was the film and the book. As heroic as this story might make out, and praiseworthy as the film might be, it was rated as probably the best film that came out in the 1950s. Yes, there was a river on the route, there was this bridge being built, and prisoners were forced to work on it by these brutal guards. And that's about the only bit of truth that was in the story. And partly because of that, a guy called Ernest Gordon, that's him just after the war with his wife, which he wasn't married at this time, he then was encouraged to, having survived this camp, the camps and the thing, to write the story of this. Because, yes, the bridge was blown up just after it was finished, but by an Allied air raid, not by a commando raid. And that was only a tiny thing of actually what happened to all these prisoners. There were several bridges being made. There was lots of atrocities, and I did not hunt out all the nasty pictures to scare you all for the rest of the day. But Captain Ernest Gordon of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders wrote a true account of what happened. And he captures pretty well the attitude of many of the guards and the prisoners, and in its own way how the railway was actually built. Miracle on the River Kwai is his version. Starts with his escape from Singapore with some other officers. Just as they were all ordered to surrender, they got a small sailing boat and were sailing, trying to get to safety, and were within 100 miles or so before they got caught and taken back to Singapore. And got left stranded on the docks because the Japanese army and the Japanese navy didn't like each other and wouldn't talk to each other. So all these prisoners are just dumped on the dockside. But there was nowhere for them to go, so they couldn't escape. They were shipped off from there to a prison camp called Shanghai. Well, here's a map I found of the bridge. You can see that the insert shows the India up in the top left-hand corner and Singapore down the bottom right. So that was the full length of the railway they were covering. This is a picture of Shanghai. It was a British Army barracks for about 1,000 troops. And something like 18,000 prisoners were stuffed in it. As you can see, they had lots of space, and this is after they're liberated and given clothes to wear. So you can imagine what the conditions were like a lot of the time. From this camp, the prisoners were constantly shipped to other camps where their work was required. So as they finished this bit of railway, they'd move on to this bit and then that bit and shunted around. But Shanghai was the main staging post. Some camps were better than others. Shanghai, being an old barracks, was, you see, was brick concrete built. Most of them were built bamboo huts, wooden huts. But all of the prisoners in all of the camps at some time suffered from bayoneting, shootings, beatings, decapitations, and the general diseases and lack of food. Because if you were ill, you didn't get food from the Japanese, and if you surrendered, even if you were ordered to surrender, if you surrendered, you weren't worth living. That was their code. So if they avoided the physical deaths, they died from overwork, starvation, or just no medical treatment. The Japanese managed to violate almost every what's called a civilized code imaginable in these camps as a result, largely because of this unworthiness of being a prisoner. Their subsequent excuse when they were captured and put on trial was, it's our military code, this is how we treat, and they didn't treat their own troops a lot better, to be honest, on that. They were quite brutal. And the other excuse the Japanese liked to come out with for doing this was, yeah, but look how many civilians you killed when you dropped the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Yeah, but you were doing this beforehand. Yeah, but yeah, and so this was the conditions they were under. So not surprisingly, the general attitude and behaviour of the prisoners deteriorated. Morale already low after being ordered to surrender when they still had a box full of ammunition in front of them. It knocks the spirit out of people, and they were stealing anything they could grab from each other, stealing food. Yeah, civilised standards had gone completely. Anyone who became sick or injured was just moved into the hospital and left to die. As I said, if you were ill, you didn't get food from the Japanese, you were left to die. Yeah. Ernest himself found himself in the hospital, suffering from malaria and worms, and then his appendix decided it had had enough of this treatment as well, and he was fortunate. The surgeon still had some anaesthetic available when they took his appendix out. But obviously that knocked him out for several months, and so he's lying in the hospital and very quickly got dysentery to add to his list of problems. And he got to the stage where he knew he was going to die, And he said, could you move me to the other end of the ward, please? Why? That's where the dead are. Yes, but the floor slopes down and this end's all wet every time it rains and that end's dry. Could you move me to the dry end, please? That was his state of mind. And then some friends came looking for him. They didn't recognise their old friend and walked past him the first time because he was so, from this strong, ruddy Scotsman to this skeleton laying on the bed, they didn't realise it was their friend. And they chatted to him and said, oh, we'll see, there's a couple of your blokes from your regiment around the camp. So they went to talk to them. And the next day, two guys strolled in. One, he gave the nickname, but one called Dusty Miller, who was a Methodist, and the other one was Dinty Moore, a Roman Catholic. And Dusty, they both began to talk to him and get his spirits up. And Dusty began to wash him, wash his wounds, wash the bandages out, and generally treat him. And they start massaging the legs to try and get circulation back, otherwise he'd never be able to walk. And obviously the other prisoners around are hearing this, because a lot of the prisoners were in the same condition, and then Dusty would finish with him and move on and so forth. So Dinty was an old school friend of his, and each day they would share their food. They would bring food to him and nurse him and continue to talk to him about anything. They weren't there giving him a Bible study, they just were chatting about life and everything going on around them. But obviously, they were both strong in their faith, and that would come out in the conversation. And all the other prisoners in the ward are listening to this and hearing what's being said and what's being discussed. And this feeling started spreading through the whole camp. Others took on this same attitude and felt they ought to do something to help their mates, their comrades, even if they'd never met them before. I've got to come and help you, mate. Let's do something for you. They even started to forgive their captors for some of what they were doing. Ernest was still on the sick list, still in the hospital for a long time, but his health was gradually improved. And with some of the other prisoners, he got approached and said, can you do some Bible classes for us, Gov? And what started of a dozen or so people, there's a couple of Australians I think came to him first of all, what started with about 12 people, within a week or two grew to over 100 people at this Bible class. Yes, the prisoners were bored, they didn't know what to do with themselves, but they wanted to learn. This grew into a university with anyone with any knowledge about anything would teach others. This literally went from woodworking, metalworking, engineering, electrical engineering, Old Testament Hebrew, New Testament Greek. If you knew something about it, you were the professor and you taught. And they had classes going on everywhere, but there was an added problem. Any notes you made had to be kept safe from the prisoners, from the guards. So you had to hide your notes, and it was difficult if you lost some of these notes, particularly in the language things. Some musical instruments actually found their way into the camp. And the Japanese saw no use for trumpets or something that had turned up, but some of the prisoners could play. And the Japanese were bored, so they asked for a concert. So the prisoners were allowed to practice their music and put on a concert to keep the guards amused. Even if their comedy acts during that were taking the mick out of them. The Japanese didn't speak English, and that wasn't a problem. Another thing that could keep their spirits up was getting news, what was happening in the world outside the camp. And some radio signallers had the foresight to dismantle the big radios when they were told to surrender in Singapore, and had hidden all the bits around them and a few other of their mates and built these radio sets. But there was a problem. Where do you get power for your radio? One man was employed by the Japanese as a lorry driver to drive this lorry out to the work camp and take the tools and bring the prisoners back and so forth. And so every night he would remove the battery from the lorry and carry it under his arm back to his barracks hut. And the Japanese said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And he goes, "Oh, well, it's this tropical weather. These batteries are very sensitive and I'm taking it back to my bunk to keep it warm overnight so it doesn't get damaged." And that's how the prisoners got their news. They had a lorry battery to run their radios from. So even they could see the funny side of what was going on around. And that section of the railway, which is only probably about 20-30 miles, was completed. That's a fraction of the time it was scheduled to take or would have taken. If they were going to build that normal, that would have been 2 years plus work. Even with the prisoners, it was expected to take 18 months, and they did it in just over the 12 months. That's how hard the prisoners were being worked. But once they finished this section, the prisoners are then moved uproute to go elsewhere and we'll start on the next section, and that's where the conditions in the camps changed. But when they went to the next camp, the university carried on with them. They carried on caring for each other. They carried on looking after the sick. And this whole attitude carried on. The Japanese had always allowed the prisoners to hold a church service of some sort. And probably most of the troops would have been to Sunday school when they were kids. That was the culture of the time. But though they had a weak faith, and Ernest admits his faith was quite superficial, quite weak when he entered this camp. He found that when he was doing this Bible study for 100 blokes and they would ask some searching questions, he had to do his homework before, and his faith got deeper and his knowledge and his love of God grew as he delved into the Bible to prepare for tomorrow's study and then tomorrow's study and so forth. He found he was growing as a result. See, instead of being a hellhole of a camp, the camp became a place where God's love started shining through. A matter of weeks, months before, the soldiers would have thought nothing of stealing your boots while you're asleep, even if you had them on. All of a sudden, they're sharing their food with the person who's sick. And that was the change that was coming over them all. Their faith went with them and spread through the other camps. And in fact, when the Allied troops arrived at the end of the war and started liberating them and saw the state of the prisoners, well, that sort of better picture, what's the difference between that and the people that came out of the concentration camps? You can tell they're liberated because they're wearing clothes and shoes, where most of them had a loincloth and that was it while they're in the camp. But when the liberators wanted to shoot the guards on the spot, if they could get hold of them, and it was the prisoners who stepped in and say no, they didn't know what they were doing. They were doing what they were told. And whilst there were some that deserved punishment and were tried and punished, it was the prisoners who stepped up and say, forgive them. Sadly, Ernest found out later that Dusty had gone up the track and to another camp, and he was crucified by this very vicious Japanese guard not long after they'd been separated. And Dinty himself got killed when the Allies sunk a prisoner of war transport ship, which the Japanese never signed the Geneva Convention, but one of the conventions was you should clearly mark this ship is carrying prisoners of war. And the Japanese didn't. And so the Allies thought it was carrying troops and torpedoed it. And that killed a load of Allied prisoners. And sadly, Ernest only found this out a couple of days after he was liberated. He didn't know this for a long time. But in fact, the hardest thing that the prisoners found after their release was the attitude of people when they returned home. They'd had 3.5 years in captivity. Ernest recounts meeting his brother at the station, and they had to pop into the hotel because he wasn't expecting to get in there till later in the day, and he'd booked a hotel room in advance. And they had to pop into this hotel to cancel the room. And so, to him, he's in quite smart gear. He's got a newish uniform that he's worn all the way from Singapore back to the UK. And all his, what few possessions he's gathered over that time are in this dirty, sweaty, mucky kit bag. He walks into the hotel and puts his bag down and goes to speak to the clerk at the counter. Can't bring that bag in here. Didn't appreciate that was luxury to him, having a bag to put his things in. To have things to put in a bag was luxury. And yet the attitude was, you can't bring that bag in here because it's dirty. And so that was quite a shock to him. Then he sort of woke up to the fact, I'm back home in Blighty. All his worldly possessions were seen as rubbish. And as I said, they were the ones he'd managed to gather, a razor and so forth, after he'd been liberated from the camp, where he'd lost everything. He was shocked and saddened rather than angry as he cancelled that room and set off for home with his brother, whilst he was warmly welcomed by his family. Obviously, it's very strange. He's now sleeping under sheets and blankets after all these years. What luxury! Complete change. When he returned home, he trained and became a minister in the Church of Scotland in 1950, and later went on to become the Presbyterian Dean of Princetown University in the United States in the mid-1950s. And he died in 2002 at the grand old age of 86. So you can survive these things. But again, many of the soldiers returning from the camps found the country had forgotten about them. The army, the 14th Army was the army out in the Far East, was known as the Forgotten Army. They got all the old equipment that was no good in Europe against the Germans, got shipped out. And so they got all the second-hand stuff, basically. And even their families had trouble accepting that these soldiers came back with a new faith. They knew what was going on. They missed the close support that they as prisoners had, that they'd given each other. They're suddenly on their own, they felt. Even though families around them, so-called friends were around them, they didn't have that comradeship. But they equally knew God was still with them. Wherever they found themselves, they still had God at their side. Thankfully, they held to their faith, and many of these ex-prisoners started working charities, or started the charity itself, applying for formal training in medicine and other disciplines. They're so used to helping one another, they had difficulty in coming home and saying, no, you don't need to do that for me. But I must. I ought to. Why not? They found that the God they met in the camps was still the same God that was helping them now they were home. And that it was their task, really, to try and explain it to people, this is what was going on. No one should have suffered like they did. But they had survived. They could tell others. And that's what they did, but they didn't. It's very hard to get someone who was in these camps to tell you about what happened. They will tell you about the love of God for them in those camps, but not what actually physically happened. Now they were home, they felt they had to share him rather than their experience. But sadly, many people didn't get the message. If you want to read this up for yourselves, the book isn't in print, but there are loads of copies available on the internet. I think I have that version at home, and that was the one I bought a month or two ago. I can lend you one of this copy. I didn't bother to get the other one off the shelf today, and I can strongly recommend it as a book to read. Yes, the language is 1950s, 60s, because that's when it's written, but it'll only cost you £3 or £4 off of eBay to get that. If you really splash out, you can get one for £5, but it won't be any different to the one I've got there. except it might have a different picture on the cover. I promise you, it will challenge your thinking. It certainly challenged mine when I read it years ago. When I reread it, I thought, oh, I'd forgotten that bit of it. Wow, yes. As I read it, think about reading it, I wonder, how would I react in those same circumstances? Could I put my faith into action the way Dusty and Dinty did, even though it ultimately led to their death? I pray that God will give me strength to do so. I don't personally have any family connections to men who suffered on the Burma Railway. But I did have an uncle who, it's very hard to trace what happened to him because he was merchant navy and he went back after Dunkirk and was captured and spent 5 years plus in a German prison camp. But I came across something when my mum died in the possessions, and the only way we could have got it, must have been his, was we think he must have been in this prison camp, German prison camp in Poland, where as the Russians were closing, the order was given to kill the prisoners. And although conditions in that camp were very brutal, and my uncle would never talk about it, the German commander refused to kill the prisoners and told them to march to Berlin from the far side of Poland. No food, no supplies, nothing, just get going there and go down that road and keep going. And quite a few thousand of the prisoners died on that march. I can't remember what it's called, Stalag 14 or 24, one of the two. But I found it stamped in a Bible or New Testament that had obviously been given to the prisoners in a pack. And I said, he doesn't appear on the list, my uncle, because he wasn't military. So you can't check the lists of who might have been there. But as I said, on this death march, they were told to get to Berlin and stay ahead of the Russian army. And when he came home, said he would never say anything about what he did in the war. So it wasn't just Japanese that treated the prisoners badly, but many others only survived because their comrades loved them and cared for them. We see that as believers as well, that God is cross with us because Adam and Eve rebelled. They didn't do what God said, and that's passed on through each one of us. But God equally loves each one of us, and through Jesus, he's given us the means to rebuild that relationship with God, to say we are part of his family. He is with us still. And I hope each one of you will read a book like this and actually pick up, this is what our God is saying to us. Caring for each other is great, but we need to do it in his strength, not just doing a good deed for today. Like, which of you old ladies is the Boy Scout going to take across the road in a minute? That's a good deed for the day. But we need to do it because we love one another in his name, because he first loved us. Thank you.